She warned me I was crossing boundaries, but I couldn't stop noticing how close she'd drawn them. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't during class, nor in the moments everyone else seemed to pay attention to. It was in a quiet corner of the library, where sunlight spilled across worn wooden tables and the dust motes danced lazily in the golden glow. She was sitting there, slightly hunched over a notebook, a pen poised thoughtfully in her hand. Her hair caught the light as she tucked a loose strand behind her ear, and for a moment, the world felt quieter than it had any right to be. I watched her unconsciously, drawn not by vanity but by something subtler, the calm precision in her gestures, the way she seemed entirely absorbed yet unhurried. The slight crease between her brows hinted at concentration, but also something softer, something quietly human. And then there was the faint scent of her perfume, delicate and comforting, lingering in the air just long enough to brush past me as I moved closer. My chest tightened, not in panic, exactly, but in awareness, as if proximity alone carried weight. When I accidentally brushed past her on the narrow aisle, her hand barely grazed mine. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it left a warmth that clung to my skin and echoed in my chest long after she had returned to her notebook. Her glance met mine, steady, unreadable, yet not unkind, and for a second I felt exposed and strangely grounded all at once. My heartbeat quickened, not in embarrassment exactly, but in anticipation, a mix of admiration and curiosity I didn't fully understand yet. I told myself I was imagining it. Teachers weren't supposed to evoke these kinds of feelings, and yet, every subtle movement of hers, the tilt of her head, the soft exhale as she considered a sentence, the quiet way she rested her chin on her hand, pulled my attention. I became aware of how close I stood, how the sunlight warmed my shoulder while her presence seemed to fill the space between us with something unspoken. There was no bold gesture, no overt sign of connection. Just her, composed, graceful, unassuming, and the inexplicable awareness that being near her made the world feel more alive, more tactile. Even in a room full of people, I felt a private gravity, a subtle pull toward her, as though the universe had conspired to make me notice every infinitesimal motion she made. By the time I left, notebook in hand and heart racing, I knew something had shifted. A tiny spark had been lit, not between us, not yet, but inside me. Something delicate, yet insistent, that whispered I would never see her the same way again. The first time we truly spoke one-on-one, it wasn't in the formal setting of a classroom, but in the quiet hallway after the last bell had rung. Most students had scattered, leaving only a few lingering footsteps and the soft hum of fluorescent lights. She stood there by the lockers, arms folded loosely, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. I approached cautiously, aware that every word, every gesture, now seemed weighted with unspoken significance. Our conversation began innocuously, clarifying an assignment, debating a small detail, but quickly took on a rhythm of its own. There was a subtle push and pull in her voice, a gentle teasing laced with authority, as if she were testing boundaries without ever crossing them. And yet, I couldn't help but notice how her gaze lingered a fraction longer than it needed to, how her eyes followed my movements with quiet interest. Each glance carried warmth, a curiosity that mirrored my own. At one point, she reached out to adjust a loose strap on my backpack. Her fingers brushed my shoulder, light but deliberate, and I felt a ripple of awareness run through me. It wasn't just a touch, it was an invitation, a spark that neither of us could openly acknowledge but both silently recognized. I caught myself holding the sensation longer than necessary, tracing it in my mind as though replaying a scene I wished would never end. Even the smallest gestures felt charged, the tilt of her head as she listened, the soft inflection in her voice, the way she leaned just slightly closer to emphasize a point. I became acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her, the subtle scent of her perfume that seemed to follow her every movement. It was intoxicating in a way I didn't dare label yet, part admiration, part longing, part something entirely undefined. The hallway felt suspended in time. Outside, the world moved on, but here, in these quiet, fleeting moments, everything was intensely immediate. I realized how much I wanted to linger in her presence, to stretch these interactions just a little longer, even though I knew the rules, even though I knew the risk of misreading the tension. By the time we parted, a shared laugh lingering between us, I felt the first ache of desire tempered by restraint. It wasn't longing in its rawest sense, not yet, but it was the unmistakable seed of emotional intimacy, planted quietly and flourishing in the small, subtle exchanges we shared. Every glance, every fleeting touch, every careful word was building a bridge between us, a bridge I wasn't sure either of us could resist crossing, even as we both pretended to maintain our distance. It hit me the first time she spoke about boundaries directly. Not in passing, not as a vague warning, but in a way that made me painfully aware of the invisible line between admiration and impropriety. We were in her office, a small, sunlit room lined with bookshelves, the air smelling faintly of old paper and her delicate perfume. I had stayed behind after class to ask about a project, hoping to extend the conversation just a little longer. She looked at me carefully, her brown eyes steady but softened with a hint of concern. "I need to remind you," she said gently, "that some lines shouldn't be crossed." The words weren't harsh, they were measured, deliberate, meant to guide rather than scold, but they landed like a quiet shock. I could feel the tension in her posture, the subtle shift of her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened briefly on the pen she held. I nodded, words caught in my throat. Inside, I felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. Admiration, desire, and respect all collided, leaving me dizzy. It was impossible to ignore how her presence made the air feel warmer, heavier, intimate in a way that shouldn't exist between student and teacher. My gaze flickered to her hands, the slight tremor as she adjusted her sleeve, the way the sunlight caught the soft curve of her cheek. Every detail became magnified, and every minor gesture seemed to echo in my chest. I realized then how blurred the line had already become in my mind. The subtle touches, the lingering glances, the unspoken understanding, all of it had pushed me closer than I thought possible. And yet, there she was, calmly restoring order, reminding me that admiration without respect could easily tip into something forbidden. Even in that moment of warning, there was a quiet tenderness in her approach. Her voice softened, almost hesitant, as though she too felt the gravity of the unspoken connection between us. I couldn't help noticing the warmth that lingered despite the caution, the way her eyes still held a spark of something unacknowledged, something alive beneath the surface. I left her office with my heart pounding, replaying every second. Her warning didn't diminish my feelings, it sharpened them. It forced me to confront the desire that had been quietly growing, the magnetic pull that drew me toward her despite the boundaries. And in that tension, I felt the first real ache of longing, a mixture of respect, restraint, and the undeniable recognition that something profound, subtle, and dangerous was unfolding between us. It happened in the most ordinary way, yet it carried a weight that neither of us could ignore. We were in the classroom after hours, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead filling the quiet space. I had come to return a textbook she had lent me earlier, or perhaps, in some unacknowledged part of my mind, to see her again. She was bent over a desk, adjusting papers, her movements deliberate and graceful. I reached across to help her with a stack of books, and our hands brushed. It was fleeting, just a touch, but the warmth of her fingers against mine lingered far longer than necessary. A shiver ran down my spine, not from cold, but from the subtle intimacy of the contact. I noticed the softness of her skin, the reassuring steadiness in her hand, and the quiet confidence she exuded even in mundane tasks. Then, as I handed her the last book, she leaned slightly closer to point something out, her shoulder brushing mine. "It was accidental," she said later, but my chest had tightened in a way I couldn't control. The faint scent of her perfume wrapped around me, mingling with the quiet rustle of paper and the distant hum of the heating system. I could feel her breath shift as she spoke softly, explaining the details of an assignment, and the warmth of her presence pressed gently against my awareness. Every gesture she made became amplified in my perception. The tilt of her head, the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the subtle brush of her sleeve against mine, all of it felt electric. It was nothing overt, nothing scandalous, yet the intimacy of proximity left me acutely aware of my own heartbeat. I could sense the tension, unspoken but undeniable, that threaded between us. When she straightened up, we both stepped back instinctively, but the energy lingered. I caught her eyes, a fleeting glance that held curiosity, warmth, and something quietly playful. It was a shared acknowledgement, unspoken, of the delicate tension that had grown between us. I left the classroom with a strange mix of exhilaration and restraint. That brief closeness had awakened something deeper, a quiet awareness of desire tempered by respect. The accidental intimacy, fleeting as it was, confirmed what I had been feeling for weeks. Being near her changed everything. The air felt charged, the world sharper, and the pull toward her undeniable. And even as I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, I knew that these moments, small, subtle, almost accidental, were the ones that mattered most, planting seeds that neither of us could ignore. It was late, almost impossibly quiet, when we found ourselves alone again. The campus had emptied, the corridors echoing faintly with distant footsteps, and the library's warm lamplight spilled softly across the wooden floors. She suggested we sit on a bench outside, under the faint glow of streetlights, to discuss a project in more detail. But as soon as we settled, the conversation drifted, naturally, to life outside assignments, to thoughts and regrets and dreams neither of us had voiced before. Her voice, usually so controlled and assured, softened as she spoke. There was a vulnerability I hadn't seen before, hidden beneath her composed exterior. She talked about choices she had made, opportunities she had missed, the quiet loneliness that sometimes settled over her evenings. Every word resonated, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it, her eyes occasionally meeting mine with an intensity that left my chest tight, her hands resting lightly on her lap as if seeking grounding. I listened, aware of every nuance, the slight tremor in her voice, the way she shifted closer to avoid the chill of the night, the soft brush of her hand against my arm when she gestured to emphasize a point. Each touch, however accidental or fleeting, sent a quiet shock through me. It was not just desire, it was connection, profound and intricate, threading through unspoken acknowledgement. When I spoke, I admitted more than I had intended. Not just about the project, but about how her presence affected me, the way I felt my thoughts scatter and my focus sharpen all at once, the way her calm assurance comforted and unsettled me simultaneously. I didn't frame it as attraction, it wasn't the time, but as honesty, as an attempt to bridge the distance that the boundaries imposed. She listened, letting the silence stretch between words. And in that quiet, we shared something almost sacred, recognition of the tension, the magnetic pull that existed even when neither of us could name it outright. A hand rested briefly on my arm, a gesture that was both comforting and electrifying. Our eyes met, and for the first time, the unspoken acknowledgement of what was simmering between us hung in the air like a tangible weight. By the time we stood to leave, the night felt different. Heavier, warmer, and more intimate. I realized that this wasn't about fleeting attraction or momentary closeness anymore, it was about understanding, seeing each other fully, and allowing ourselves to feel without stepping beyond what we could. And as she smiled, softly, almost shyly, I understood that this delicate balance, vulnerability, honesty, and restraint, was the bridge that was slowly, irrevocably drawing us closer. It was late afternoon when we found ourselves walking along the quiet campus paths, the sun dipping low and casting long, golden shadows across the lawns. The world felt suspended in a soft, amber glow, every detail sharper and warmer than usual. The air carried the faint scent of autumn leaves, mixed with the subtle trace of her perfume, a fragrance that had become impossible to ignore. I could feel her presence beside me, just close enough for me to sense her warmth without crossing the invisible line she had so carefully maintained. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about classwork or assignments. It was tentative, hesitant, but charged with a gravity that neither of us could name outright. She spoke softly, almost in whispers, about how life sometimes felt heavier than it should, and how moments like these, quiet, unhurried, shared with someone who understands, felt fleeting yet precious. Her eyes occasionally met mine, searching, curious, and I felt a pull I could no longer deny. I responded with honesty, admitting the thoughts and feelings I had carefully kept to myself. The admiration, the fascination, the subtle longing that had grown steadily over weeks. I didn't speak of desire in a crude sense, rather, I described the effect her presence had on me, the way her laughter lingered in my chest, how her calm confidence unsettled and grounded me simultaneously, how even the briefest touch left a warmth that refused to fade. There was a pause after I spoke, a silence filled with the unspoken. She glanced down, then back at me, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. Her hand brushed lightly against mine, not fully held, not daring to linger, but enough to send a ripple of awareness through me. The contact was deliberate in its subtlety, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension we had nurtured in hushed glances and fleeting touches. "I shouldn't feel this way," she murmured, voice soft, almost confessional, "but, your presence, it's different. You make things feel lighter, even when I try to remind myself of the rules." Her fingers traced a line on the railing beside us, close but not touching mine, the space between charged with quiet electricity. I nodded, feeling the weight and the wonder of it. The age difference, the societal expectations, the professional boundaries, all of it existed, yet none could diminish what was quietly growing between us. That walk, under the fading sunlight, was a confession without labels, a moment of shared desire, tempered by respect and the understanding that this connection was as fragile as it was intense. By the time we parted, the air between us felt thick with unspoken promises. Our eyes met one last time, lingering, holding everything that words could not. And I realized that what had started as fascination, curiosity, and subtle attraction had evolved into something undeniable, a desire that was both quiet and consuming, waiting for the right time to be fully acknowledged. It was a quiet afternoon when we met again, this time with no assignments, no formal reason to linger together, just a choice, unspoken yet mutual, to share a few moments of each other's presence. We sat on a bench beneath the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, its leaves rustling softly in the gentle breeze. Sunlight dappled the ground, creating a warm, almost ethereal glow around us, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, intimate even, because it carried the weight of everything we had felt over the past weeks. The glances that lingered, the fleeting touches that sent ripples through our awareness, the words that were half-spoken and fully felt, all of it had built an invisible bridge between us. And now, as we sat side by side, close enough to feel each other's presence, I realized that distance was no longer required to define us. Her hand brushed lightly against mine, not a full embrace, not a deliberate hold, just the softest contact, a confirmation of what had been quietly growing between us. I felt her warmth, steady and grounding, and the faint rhythm of her heartbeat seemed to echo in my chest. We shared a smile, gentle and knowing, acknowledging the subtle dance of restraint and desire that had defined our connection. We talked then, not of rules or expectations, but of understanding, of mutual respect and admiration. She admitted, softly, that she had felt the same pull I had, an attraction tempered by experience, hesitation, and the careful maintenance of boundaries. I spoke of how she had shifted my perception of the world, of how even small gestures, an encouraging glance, a touch on the shoulder, a shared laugh, had left a lasting imprint on me. There was no rush, no dramatic confession, no breaking of societal norms. Just presence, quiet acknowledgement, and the intimacy of shared understanding. She leaned back slightly, letting the sunlight warm her face, and I realized that the beauty of our connection lay not in what we had wanted to claim, but in what we had allowed ourselves to feel, trust, respect, and a deep, enduring closeness that didn't require labels. As we rose to leave, our hands brushed again, lingering slightly longer this time. A quiet, affectionate touch, safe, yet laden with meaning. We walked away together, steps in sync, hearts quietly aligned. The story didn't end with grand declarations or forbidden crossing, it ended with warmth, understanding, and a bond that had grown slowly, deliberately, and irrevocably. For the first time, I felt that desire and respect could coexist without conflict, that emotional intimacy could be as profound as physical closeness, and that some connections were worth nurturing quietly, letting them grow into something lasting, meaningful, and entirely ours. If you felt the tension, the longing, and the quiet magic of this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more age gap romance tales. Share your thoughts in the comments, Have you ever felt a connection so subtle, yet impossible to ignore? Turn on notifications so you never miss a slow burn story that lingers in your heart.